Police mocked a Mexican teen in public. Then a mysterious general changed everything. It started on a gray afternoon in the heart of downtown Los Angeles. The courthouse steps were slick from a light drizzle earlier that morning, the kind of rain that didn't clean the city but made it smell like wet concrete and old rust. A young girl, no more than 16, stood alone near the base of the marble stairs, clutching a worn leather folder to her chest. Her jeans were too faded, her white sneakers dusted with city grime, and her black braid trailed down the back of an oversized sweatshirt. Her name was Camila Ortega, and she had done nothing wrong. Yet every eye that passed her darted away with the same mixture of disregard and suspicion, like she was just another problem on the street. She waited patiently in the line outside the courthouse metal detectors, the only one not speaking, not scrolling through her phone, not arguing with a public defender. And then, without warning, the uniformed officer stationed by the door stepped forward, pointed directly at her, and said loud enough for all to hear, "You, step aside." Camila blinked, uncertain. "Me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The officer nodded. "You heard me. Backpack on the ground. Hands where I can see them." The metal detectors fell silent. Everyone turned. Some smirked. Others stepped away. The tension wrapped around her like wet cloth. Camila did as she was told. She placed her old canvas backpack on the ground and slowly raised her hands. Her folder slipped from her grasp and landed at the officer's feet. Papers spilled out, some handwritten, some typed, all carefully arranged, all now scattered and wet. "What's this, huh?" the officer muttered, nudging the papers with the toe of his boot. "Fake documents? What are you trying to pull, little girl?" Camila tried to speak, but her throat tightened. These were school papers. A petition. An appeal to reinstate her scholarship. A note from her counselor. Her birth certificate. Her mother's death certificate. Ole Bora. All stepped on. The officer didn't care. "Turn around," he barked. "Now!" People behind her began murmuring. A few pulled out phones. Camila's cheeks flushed with shame as the officer grabbed her elbow and twisted her gently, but firmly, to face the wall. She didn't resist. She didn't speak. Not even when he patted her down in full view of strangers. Not even when one of her classmates, someone from her biology class, passed by and stared at her with eyes that said everything: pity, disgust, surprise. It was supposed to be a simple day. A court clerk had told her to bring these papers to the courthouse so she could meet with the youth advocate. She had come alone because there was no one else. Her aunt had to work. No friends could leave school. She thought she'd be in and out. She hadn't expected this. "Is this even your name?" the officer asked, holding up one of the wet documents. He didn't wait for her answer. Figures. These kids all think they can fake their way into something. A second officer approached, older, slightly more composed. He glanced at Camila, at the mess of papers on the ground, and then at his partner. "What's going on here?" he asked. "Routine check," the first officer replied, eyes still on Camila. "Something's off with her." The second officer didn't reply. He knelt slowly, picked up one of the soaked papers, and scanned it. Then another. His brow furrowed. "You said these are fake?" he asked his partner. "Looks like a school petition. You know, real civic stuff." The first officer rolled his eyes. "Still doesn't look right." But the second officer stood, handed Camila her papers one by one, and said quietly, "You're okay. Go ahead." Camila bowed slightly in thanks, her hands shaking as she stuffed the wet sheets back into her folder. She didn't look up as she passed through security. She didn't look back. She just walked forward, past the glances and whispers, through the metal gates, and into the belly of the courthouse where the walls echoed with footsteps and forgotten stories. And out of view, in a dimly lit parking lot across the street, a man in a black sedan lowered his binoculars. His gray mustache twitched. His hand clenched the steering wheel. He had seen everything. His uniform was neatly folded in a suitcase beside him, untouched for nearly 7 years. The medals were still there. The stars. The nameplate. General Alonso Ortega. He hadn't told Camila he was watching. He hadn't told anyone he had returned to the country. He hadn't spoken since her mother's funeral. But today, watching that officer humiliate his granddaughter in public, He knew something in him had cracked open. The silence would not last much longer. Back inside, Camila finally found the office she had been looking for. The clerk, a tired woman in her 50s with horn-rimmed glasses, didn't even glance up as she muttered, "Take a seat." Camila sat. The chair squeaked beneath her. Water dripped from her folder onto the tile floor. Her hands were still trembling. Her eyes burned. She kept her head down, waiting for her name to be called. But her thoughts were far away. She remembered the last words her mother ever told her, whispered between shallow breaths in a hospital bed that smelled like bleach and flowers. "No matter what happens, Mija, hold your head high. You come from people who never bowed." Camila hadn't understood it then. She had just cried. But now, sitting in this room, in this building, after being searched and shamed, she felt a small spark deep inside her chest. It was barely there, but it was real. Meanwhile, outside, the first officer who had humiliated her returned to his post, smirking, not even remembering her name. To him, she was just another brown girl with papers. But soon, the whole precinct would learn the truth. Soon, even he would learn who she really was. And when that moment came, it wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be angry. It would be quiet, like a door slowly creaking open in a courtroom hallway, like footsteps approaching from behind, like justice arriving without warning. Welcome to Cracks of Light, where the smallest acts of cruelty meet the strongest walls of silent dignity. If this story has stirred something in your heart, don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with someone who still believes in decency. This is just the beginning of Camila's story. What happened next will surprise everyone, including the ones who thought they held all the power. Camila didn't speak of it to anyone. Not to the court clerk, not to the receptionist who signed her name wrong on the check-in sheet, not to the man who pushed past her in the hallway like she was invisible. She sat through her appointment, handed in her soggy documents, and when it was all over, she stepped out into the cold Los Angeles air without looking back. There was no apology, no one chasing after her to explain the humiliation, no reassurance that what had happened wasn't normal. Because for Camila, in some ways it was. This wasn't the first time she'd been looked at like she didn't belong. It wouldn't be the last. 2 weeks later, she applied for a job at a small diner a few blocks from her school. The place had a faded mural of Frida Kahlo on the sidewall and served the kind of greasy food that came in plastic baskets. She wore her cleanest clothes, brought a printed resume she'd typed at the library, and smiled through the pain in her back from carrying her school books across town every day. The manager, a tall white woman with a clipped voice and a fake smile, didn't even take the resume from her hands. She looked Camila up and down and said, "We're not hiring right now." Behind her, Camila could see a help wanted sign taped to the window. She pointed gently toward it, confused. The woman's smile dropped. "We're not hiring for you." Camila nodded, folded the resume back in her backpack, and walked away. No anger, no tears, just a hollow space growing larger inside her. She applied at 2 more places that day. A laundromat said she was too young. A corner store said they'd lost her application. At school, things were no better. One of her classmates filmed her during lunch as she took out leftover rice and beans from a reused plastic container. They added sound effects, laughed in the hallway. She found the video online the next morning. Over 1,000 views. Comments like "Taco Queen" and "Looks like she eats in the janitor's closet." No teacher said a word. A few looked uncomfortable. No one stopped it. Camila stopped eating lunch at school after that. She stayed late at the library to use the internet. Printed job applications she never got called back on. Researched community colleges. Stared too long at photos of people smiling in caps and gowns, trying to imagine herself among them. At home, her aunt, who worked nights cleaning offices downtown, was too tired to notice Camila's swollen eyes or her long silences. She had taken Camila in after her mother died, but grief lived between them like a language neither could speak. Some nights, Camila would sit by the small altar in the corner of their apartment, where her mother's picture rested between candles and dried roses. She didn't pray. She didn't cry. She just looked, as if waiting for her mother to blink or say something. The days bled together. Small humiliations piled up. Once, a man accused her of shoplifting at a gas station because she looked shifty. Another time, a woman locked her car doors as Camila walked past in broad daylight. It was always subtle, always sharp, and never enough to make a scene, but enough to carve her soul one little cut at a time. Still, Camila didn't stop. She kept showing up, kept trying, kept hoping that maybe, somewhere, someone would see her for who she really was. One afternoon, walking home from school, she saw an elderly man drop his wallet at the bus stop. He was dressed in worn slacks and a threadbare sweater, with a cane hooked over his arm. She picked it up and called after him. "Excuse me, sir, you dropped this." He turned, surprised, then smiled gratefully as she handed it to him. "Thank you, Mija," he said, his voice hoarse but kind. Not many would do that these days. Camila smiled, shook her head. "It's nothing." She started to walk away, but the man called out, "Your mother must have raised you right." Camila paused. Her shoulders tightened. She turned slightly and said quietly, "She did." Then she disappeared around the corner. What Camila didn't know was that a man sitting in a black SUV nearby had seen the entire exchange. It wasn't the first time he had followed her from a distance. Ever since the courthouse incident, he had taken to watching her a few times a week, never letting himself be seen. General Alonso Ortega, once a national hero, now just a shadow in a city that didn't recognize him. His health wasn't what it used to be. His legs ached, his breath came shallow some mornings. But watching Camila gave him purpose. She didn't know who he was, had never met him. She only knew that her mother's father had been a soldier once, a name she whispered when things got bad. Abuelo would have known what to do, she'd say. The general had missed too much already. He hadn't come to the funeral, hadn't held her mother's hand in the final hours. Shame had kept him away. Regret had rooted him in silence. But now, seeing what the world did to Camila, what it thought it could get away with because she had no armor, he knew he had waited long enough. The final push came the following week. Camila had applied for a scholarship through her school. She had the grades, the letters, everything. But during a school assembly, the counselor announced the winners on stage. Her name wasn't called. She smiled anyway, clapped for the others. When she approached afterward to ask, the counselor glanced at her and said, "Oh, I didn't think you'd be eligible. We needed someone with a stronger community presence." Camila blinked. "But I volunteer at the shelter. I tutor ESL kids every week." The counselor raised her eyebrows, unimpressed. "Right. Well, the decision's final." Camila turned away before she cried. That night, she stayed out late, walking through her old neighborhood. Past the bakery where her mother used to buy sweetbread. Past the church with the cracked bell tower. She sat at the edge of the canal where the water barely moved. And for the first time in months, she whispered out loud, "I'm tired." Just that. Nothing more. Nothing dramatic. Just tired. Of proving herself. Of being polite. Of swallowing every insult and walking away. What she didn't see was the man standing under a flickering street lamp across the water. Watching. Listening. And making a decision. The next morning, inside a quiet government office tucked into a federal building downtown, a man in a military-style coat entered unannounced. The receptionist looked up, startled. "Can I help you?" The man placed a sealed envelope on the counter. "It's time," he said. "Make sure this gets to the police chief." Then he turned and left. No name, no signature. But inside that envelope were photos, documents, and one very specific request. Later that day, the chief would open the file and pale. He would call his deputy, then a councilman. And before sunset, every precinct in the city would be buzzing with the same quiet question. Who is Camila Ortega? What they would find out next would unravel more than reputations. It would shake them. Because Camila had no idea that the man who had watched her quietly all these weeks was once the most decorated officer in the Mexican military, a man who had commanded entire cities, who had dined with presidents, and who had walked away from it all when politics dirted the medals he once wore with pride. She didn't know that her small acts of dignity were being recorded, or that her name was about to echo in places she never imagined. The girl who had once been laughed at for bringing rice to school was about to be honored in the most unexpected way. But she wasn't waiting for it. She didn't expect rescue. She was still in motion, still applying for jobs, still walking into rooms where no one looked up. Because even if the world never saw her, Camila Ortega refused to disappear. And in that refusal, she was already winning. The third blow came on a Thursday morning, unassuming, quiet, like all betrayals that hurt the most. Camila arrived at her school just after sunrise, her backpack heavier than usual with 3 textbooks and a small container of tamales she had made with her aunt the night before. She was planning to share them with her English teacher, Ms. Delaney, who had once told her she reminded her of the daughter she never had. But before she could get a class, she was called to the front office. The secretary handed her a folded letter and didn't say a word. Camila opened it in the hallway. It was from a district. They were denying her request to transfer into the advanced placement program. The reasons stated behavioral concerns and a lack of leadership potential. Camila's heart skipped. She hadn't had a single referral. She volunteered weekly. She had straight A's. But it didn't matter. She knew what it meant. It meant someone had whispered something behind closed doors. It meant that her presence, her voice, her face had made someone uncomfortable. She folded the letter neatly, walked into the restroom, and sat in the last stall until the warning bell rang. Her hands were shaking, not with sadness, but with something she didn't recognize at first. It wasn't defeat. It was something heavier, angrier. That afternoon, she returned home to find her backpack torn open. Her aunt had moved the furniture while cleaning and accidentally knocked it off the hook. Her folder was split, papers scattered, and in the middle of it all, one document missing. The only copy of her mother's death certificate. The original. Camila dropped to her knees, sorting through everything with frantic hands. But it was gone. Her aunt hovered in the doorway, helpless. "Mija, I didn't know. I didn't see it." Camila didn't blame her. She didn't say anything. She just picked up the rest of the papers, restacked them quietly, and sat on the floor in silence. Later that night, while her aunt slept, Camila walked to the 24-hour printing shop across town, hoping they might still have the scanned version on file from months ago. They didn't. The employee, a young man with headphones around his neck, barely looked up. "We purge scans every 30 days. Saw the..." Camila left the shop just past midnight, the cold biting her skin through her thin sweater. She stopped at a bench near the train tracks, sat, and for the first time in years, thought about quitting. Not life, but the fight. The trying. The constant push forward. She imagined what it would feel like to stop caring, to let go of the idea that anything good was ever coming. But then, something happened. A voice. Low, familiar, but distant. "You still walk like your mother." Camila looked up sharply. At first, she saw only shadows. Then, from under the overpass, an older man stepped into the dim yellow of the street lamp. Gray hair, cropped short. Wrinkled brown face, square jaw. He held a cane in one hand, a thick wool coat draped over his shoulders like armor. She stood slowly, instinctively cautious. "Do I know you?" she asked. The man smiled faintly. "Not yet." He didn't come closer. "Your mother, Elena, used to sit here when she was your age. Always with a notebook, always alone. I walked past her for weeks before I finally said hello." Camila's chest tightened. "You knew her?" He nodded. "Very well." She studied his face. The strong eyes, the stillness in his shoulders. Something in her bones pulled tight. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer right away. He looked toward the tracks, then back at her. "The world's been cruel to you, hasn't it?" She didn't answer. He stepped closer now, careful not to startle her. "Cruel in ways you didn't deserve. But you kept your head up. You didn't beg. You didn't scream. You walked through it with grace. And that is why you're not broken." Camila swallowed hard. Her voice cracked. "I've lost everything." "Not everything," he said. "Not yet." Then he pulled something from the inside of his coat and handed it to her. It was a small envelope. Inside was a new copy of her mother's death certificate. Camila stared at it, stunned. "How? I have my ways," he said, then turned to leave. "Wait," she said. "Who are you?" He paused, then looked over his shoulder. "A man who loved your mother, and who owes her more than the world will ever understand." And just like that, he disappeared into the dark. Camila stood there for a long time, staring at the paper in her hands. Her fingers trembled, not from cold, but from something deeper, something waking. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table, writing. Not for school, not for any scholarship, just for herself. By sunrise, she had filled 12 pages with everything she'd never said. About her mother, her anger, her exhaustion, her hope. And in the corner of the last page, she wrote one sentence. I am still here. That morning, the police officer who had once humiliated her at the courthouse came across a plain brown envelope on his desk. No return address. Inside was a photo, a still from the courthouse security footage. His hand gripping Camila's shoulder. Her face turned in pain. The footage had been copied and printed in high resolution. Beneath it, in red pen, 3 words, she is not alone. He stared at it, sweating. No one else had seen it yet, but they would. That was only the beginning. At City Hall, another envelope arrived, this time addressed to the mayor's chief of staff. Inside were 3 notarized letters, each written by people who had seen Camila's acts of kindness firsthand. A bus driver, a teacher, a man from the shelter. Along with them, a letter of recommendation signed by someone simply referred to as General Ortega. No title, no resume, just a signature that, to those who knew, carried more weight than gold. And in a law office uptown, a young attorney read an email that simply said, "Review this file. I believe the girl you once spoke of deserves a second look." Attached was everything. Her schoolwork, her volunteer history, the video of the incident. The attorney's hand froze over the mouse. He remembered her. He remembered the girl who had helped him after his car had broken down years ago, without knowing who he was, without asking for anything. He remembered her name, Camila, and suddenly pieces began falling into place. The girl who had once walked invisible was about to be seen. The silence was cracking. The ground beneath those who had mocked her was shifting, not with noise, not with fire, but with quiet, unstoppable force, like a mountain moving 1 inch at a time. The world hadn't given her a seat at the table, so now someone else would make sure the table came to her. And while Camila still walked through each day like nothing had changed, somewhere deep inside, she felt it. The shift, the pulse, like standing at the edge of something just beginning. She didn't know yet who the man under the street lamp truly was. She didn't know yet how far her story had traveled. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was not alone anymore. Equals the diner on 5th Street was quiet that morning. A dull hum from the overhead lights mixed with the clink of ceramic mugs and the occasional scrape of toast on plates. It was a slow hour. Only a few regulars sat at the counter, sipping black coffee, flipping through folded newspapers like time had stopped somewhere between the 1980s and now. Then the door opened. The little bell above it jingled, but no one looked up right away. Only when the footsteps reached the center of the room did heads slowly turn. A man in a dark gray suit stood still, tall and composed, his presence almost out of place among the cracked linoleum and faded booths. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, and a faint scar traced the edge of his cheekbone, barely visible unless you were close. His eyes scanned the room once, not with curiosity, but precision. Then he spoke, his voice low but firm. "I'm looking for the girl who was turned away last week." The waitress behind the counter blinked. "Excuse me." He repeated it, slower. "The young woman who applied for work. Camila Ortega. I was told she was turned away." The manager, the same one who had dismissed Camila without reading her resume, stepped out from the back. Her arms crossed, annoyance already forming on her lips. "We didn't hire her. That's not a crime." The man reached into his coat and pulled out a single photograph. He placed it gently on the counter. It showed Camila, standing in the rain outside the courthouse, papers clutched to her chest, face tight with shame. Another still showed the officer's hand gripping her shoulder. Then a third photo, Camila returning a lost wallet to the old man at the bus stop. The photos were time-stamped, clean, precise, real. The waitress leaned over and stared. Her hand went to her mouth. The manager paled. "Who are you?" she asked. He met her eyes and answered without hesitation. "Her grandfather." He turned and walked out without another word. Across the city, something was shifting. Small details began surfacing in unusual places. The superintendent of the school district received a phone call from a private number. A man's voice said calmly, "You'll want to review the AP selection process again, especially for a student named Camila Ortega." Then the line went dead. Moments later, a manila folder was delivered by courier. Inside, a notarized letter written by one of Mexico's most decorated generals, retired but not forgotten, vouching for the character, intelligence, and resilience of his granddaughter. That letter was circulated to every board member within the hour. The officer from the courthouse, Officer Travis Langley, was called into the chief's office later that afternoon. A monitor played back the footage of his interaction with Camila, frame by frame. No audio. Just image after image of his aggressive posture, his dismissive attitude, and her quiet compliance. The chief didn't speak for a long time. Then he finally asked, "Did she resist?" Langley shook his head. "No." "Did she break the law?" "No." "Did you have any reason to suspect her of a crime?" Langley hesitated. "She looked out of place." The chief leaned back in his chair. "That's not a reason. That's a prejudice." Langley's mouth opened, then closed. The chief continued, "We've been contacted by a federal liaison. You've been named in a formal complaint. Effective immediately, you're being placed on unpaid administrative leave." Langley stood in disbelief. "You're serious?" "As serious as the general's letter," the chief replied. "And I suggest you don't underestimate the weight that man still carries in military circles." Meanwhile, Camila remained unaware of the wave crashing behind her. She was still walking to school each day, still applying for scholarships, still helping her aunt mop the floors of the apartment complex every weekend. But the people around her had begun to change. Her English teacher, Ms. Delaney, asked her to stay after class. "Camila," she said gently, I owe you an apology. I saw the video. I should have said something sooner." Camila looked down, unsure. "It's okay." "No, it's not. And I want you to know that your voice matters. You matter. If you're willing, I'd like to nominate you for a leadership program I oversee. It's not much, but it's a start." Camila blinked, trying to process the offer. "Thank you," she said softly. Across the city, the attorney who had once been helped by Camila when his car broke down, now a partner at a firm, drafted a legal appeal for Camila's AP rejection and offered pro bono assistance for any future academic disputes. He also reached out to a local paper with a tip. The next week, a feature ran on the front page of the Metro section. The headline read, "Invisible No More, the Quiet Strength of Camila Ortega." The photo beneath it showed her sitting alone at a school desk, head down, pen in hand. The article didn't sensationalize. It didn't dramatize. It told the truth. Her truth. And the city listened. At the next school board meeting, community members showed up with signs. Teachers spoke. Parents spoke. A former soldier who had once served under General Ortega gave a tearful statement. "All my life to that man. If his granddaughter was treated like a criminal in broad daylight, then something is deeply broken in this city." Camila wasn't at the meeting. She didn't know it was happening. She was helping her aunt fix a leaky faucet, kneeling on the kitchen floor, sleeves rolled up. But the call came that evening. The superintendent's office. She had been reinstated into the AP program, with a full scholarship from a private donor who asked to remain anonymous. Camila held the phone in silence, unsure whether to laugh or cry. Her aunt hugged her for the first time in weeks. "Your mama will be so proud," she whispered. The next day, Camila walked past the same police station where Officer Langley had once stared her down. She didn't look in through the windows. She didn't need to, because in her hand was a letter, stamped, signed, and sealed. An official request for community review of police conduct, co-signed by 3 legal firms and a military veterans alliance. She had become more than a victim. She had become a force. And as she dropped that letter into the mailbox outside the courthouse, she didn't smile or cheer. She just stood for a moment, eyes closed, feeling the air move around her like something sacred. Across the street, General Ortega watched from the shadow of a tree. He didn't approach. Not yet. There would be time for that. For now, it was enough to know she was standing, that she was rising, that she was everything her mother had been, and more. The people who once laughed at her had gone quiet. The officer who mocked her had vanished from his post. And in the silence that followed, dignity bloomed. Not loudly, not to applause, but in the quiet strength of a girl who kept walking forward even when the world told her to stop. Camila Ortega had not asked for revenge. She had not demanded power. She had simply held on to who she was, and that alone had been enough to change everything. It had been 1 month since the city first heard Camila's name. The waves her story made were not the kind that crashed loudly against headlines and viral videos. Instead, they were quiet, deep, and enduring, like a shift in current below the surface. At school, students who once walked past her without a glance now nodded. Some even offered quiet apologies. Teachers who had overlooked her raised their eyes when she spoke. But Camila didn't change how she moved through the world. She still arrived early, left late, and kept her head down. What had shifted was not her voice, but the space around it. People listened now. That Friday morning, she woke to the soft sound of birdsong outside her bedroom window and the smell of chilaquiles cooking in the kitchen. Her aunt, who never had time for breakfast, had woken early and made a full plate. Camila blinked at the sight. "What's this?" she asked. Her aunt smiled. "It's for you. For everything." Camila sat down slowly, letting the warmth of the food sink in. She didn't realize how long it had been since someone made something just for her. After breakfast, she dressed in her cleanest blouse and walked the 12 blocks to the small apartment complex on Olvera Street. The place was quiet, tucked behind a row of tamarind trees. She rang the bell marked Unit 4. A woman opened the door. She was older, with soft lines around her eyes and an oxygen tube clipped beneath her nose. "Are you the volunteer?" she asked. Camila nodded. "Yes, ma'am." From the shelter, the woman stepped aside. "Come in." That day, Camila cleaned the kitchen, watered the potted plants on the windowsill, and read aloud from a book the woman's eyes were too tired to follow. It was something she had started doing once a week, visiting seniors who lived alone. No one asked her to. No one paid her. She just did it, because even after everything, her instinct was to give. That same week, Ms. Delaney announced that Camila had been selected to attend a youth leadership conference in Sacramento. The nomination came from a local nonprofit, and the trip was fully funded. Camila's first response was hesitation. She had never left the city, never stayed overnight in a hotel, never worn anything that wasn't borrowed or thrifted. But her aunt insisted, and so did her counselor, who now greeted her with the warmth she had once reserved for others. "You belong in rooms like that," she told Camila. "Don't ever think you don't." Before she left for the conference, Camila received a letter. It had no return address, just her name written in strong block letters. Inside, a single sheet of thick paper. Typed words. Brief. Direct. "Your strength is inherited. Your dignity is earned. The path ahead is yours now. Walk it without fear." It wasn't signed, but she knew who it was from. When she boarded the bus to Sacramento, she carried the letter in her coat pocket. She sat by the window, watching the city blur into green fields and distant hills, feeling like she was stepping into a version of herself she had once thought unreachable. The conference hall was full of young people in suits and blazers, all talking quickly and loudly. Camila fell out of place at first, unsure of what to say or how to say it. But during one breakout session, a moderator asked, "Who here has experienced injustice firsthand?" Silence. Then Camila raised her hand. And when she spoke, she didn't stumble. She didn't soften her words. She told the truth. About the day at the courthouse. About the rejections. The nights walking home in the cold. The silence. The watching. The way she kept showing up anyway. When she finished, the room was still. One girl near the back wiped her eyes. A boy nodded slowly, then clapped. Others followed, not for the drama of her story, but for the quiet courage in her voice. Afterward, a woman approached her. Well-dressed, poised. She handed Camila a business card. "If you ever consider college on the East Coast," she said, "I'd like to help." Camila took the card gently, unsure of what it all meant yet, but certain she would remember the woman's name. That night, in her hotel room, she sat by the window and looked out over a city she didn't know. The lights flickered like stars. She opened her notebook and began to write. Not an essay, not an application, just a letter to her mother, telling her everything, how she had made it, how she had kept going. How people had started to see her, not as a poor girl or a quiet girl or a brown girl, but simply as Camila. And that was enough. When she returned home, the changes kept coming. A local artist painted a mural in her neighborhood. It showed a girl in profile, facing the sun, with words around her in Spanish and English. You do not have to be loud to be powerful. A reporter from a national news outlet requested an interview. Camila declined. She didn't want to become a headline. She didn't need fame. All she wanted was a life she could live with dignity. So she accepted a job tutoring middle school students at a community center. 3 days a week, after school, she sat with kids who reminded her of herself, quiet, overlooked, carrying too much. She taught them not just math and writing, but how to speak without lowering their eyes. How to stand tall even when the room made them feel small. One afternoon, as she walked home from the center, she saw a man standing near the steps of her apartment building. Gray hair, a cane, that coat. She stopped. You came back, she said. The man nodded. I never left. I was just waiting for the right moment. Is this it? She asked. He smiled. I think so. Camila walked toward him, slowly. Then, without a word, she hugged him. The embrace was quiet, not dramatic, but full of time lost, full of things never said, full of a history passed down not through stories, but through blood. That evening, they sat together in the living room while her aunt made dinner. Camila showed him her schoolwork, the mural photo, the scholarship letters. He didn't say much, just listened. But at one point, he placed his hand gently over hers and said, Your mother, she would be proud of the woman you've become. Camila blinked back tears. I hope so. He nodded. She would. She absolutely would. From that day forward, he came by once a week. Sometimes with books. Sometimes with stories. Sometimes just to sit in silence. He never spoke of his past in full detail. But Camila understood now that strength didn't always shout. Sometimes it simply endured. And in enduring, it changed the world around it. By the end of the year, Camila had been offered a position as a youth ambassador for the city's education board. Not because she was the loudest or the most connected, but because she had become something rare. A symbol, a quiet reminder that injustice can be undone, that dignity can be restored, that a single girl, humiliated in public, can rise with so much grace that the world has no choice but to sit up and listen. And she never forgot where she came from. She never stopped helping others. She never traded her gentleness for the harshness that once tried to crush her. She simply kept walking, head high, heart open, the same girl, but now no longer invisible. It was a Sunday morning when the photo appeared in the community center's lobby. No one said who had hung it. There was no plaque, no fancy frame, just a quiet image pinned above the bookshelf where the children kept their worn paperbacks and secondhand encyclopedias. In the photo, Camila sat cross-legged on the floor, a young boy leaning against her shoulder, his eyes closed, a book in her lap. Sunlight streamed through the window, catching her in that exact moment. Half smiling, present, calm. The caption beneath was written in neat, simple handwriting. It read, For the ones who never stopped showing up. By the time she noticed it, the children had already begun calling it the lucky photo. They touched it before tests. They pointed to it when they felt scared. Camila didn't say anything. She just smiled, adjusted the books on the shelf, and went back to helping them find words they didn't yet know how to spell. Her life didn't change with headlines or cameras. It changed with mornings like these, with small hands tugging at her sleeve, asking her to read one more page. With her aunt waiting with warm soup after long days. With her grandfather now sitting every Saturday at the little park bench 2 blocks from their apartment, just to wave when she passed by. Sometimes she sat beside him. Sometimes they talked about the past. Not the wounds or regrets, but the parts that still mattered. Like how her mother once danced barefoot in the rain. Or how Camila used to fall asleep holding a toy lion she believed would protect her. They would laugh softly. The kind of laughter that comes from healing. Not all scars fade. Some stay as reminders. But Camila no longer saw them as marks of shame. She wore them the way trees wear knots in their bark. Signs of growth. Evidence that she had survived. She didn't go back to the courthouse. She didn't see the officer again. But she no longer feared places like that, because she knew now that power isn't found in uniforms or titles. It's found in grace, in choosing not to harden, in choosing to keep being kind when the world expects you to fold. That spring, Camila received a handwritten letter from a girl across the city. It read, "They laughed when I tried to join the debate team. Then our teacher told us your story. I didn't quit. I made it to finals. Thank you for not giving up." There were others. A boy from a shelter who started writing poetry after she visited. A woman in her 60s who returned to school after hearing Camila speak. None of them had ever met her in person, but her story had moved through quiet corners, one person at a time. Not viral, not loud, but lasting. Camila kept all the letters in a box under her bed. On nights when the world felt too heavy again, she opened it, reread their words, remembered why she kept going. Not for recognition, but because dignity, once awakened, doesn't sleep again. She walked to school every day, still wearing her old sneakers. She still helped her aunt at the corner store on weekends. Still cooked rice and beans on a single hot plate when they were short on bills. But now, when she walked down the street, people saw her. Not because of what had happened, but because of who she had chosen to become. The girl who returned wallets. The girl who refused to be cruel, even when given every reason to be. The girl who reminded the city what quiet strength looks like. On the first anniversary of her mother's death, Camila visited the small cemetery tucked behind the mission. She wore a white blouse, brought marigolds and a letter. As she knelt at the headstone, her grandfather stood beside her, silent, steady. When she finished reading the letter, she placed it gently under the flowers. "She never got to see me become anything," Camila said. Her voice didn't break, but I hope she knows now. The general nodded, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. She always knew. She just didn't get to live long enough to watch you prove her right. Camila looked up at the sky, the sunlight filtering through the oak branches above. And for the first time in a long time, she felt peace. Not the kind that comes from things being easy, but the kind that comes from knowing you've walked through fire and still held on to yourself. That night, as the sun set over the city, Camila sat on the rooftop of their apartment building. Her legs dangled over the ledge, a cup of cinnamon tea warming her palms. She watched the lights flicker on, one by one, like stars being called to attention. Somewhere below, children laughed. Dogs barked. Life moved as it always had. But for her, it felt different now. Not perfect, but whole. And in that stillness, she understood something her mother had once whispered, but she hadn't fully grasped until now. That being strong doesn't always mean fighting back. Sometimes it just means continuing to love, to show up, to rise again after every fall. In a city that once ignored her, Camila Ortega had become a name spoken with respect. Not because she shouted, but because she listened. Not because she demanded, but because she endured. And most of all, because she never let the darkness around her dim the light within her. If you've been moved by this story, consider sharing it. Let someone out there know that being unseen is not the same as being unworthy. That strength isn't always loud. That sometimes the quietest people carry the deepest power. This is Cracks of Light. And sometimes it only takes one girl to remind the world that dignity, once awakened, is impossible to silence.